And for me, I was just like, it's your chance to kind of be humble about it. And
Yeah.
instead, not once did they mention the survivors. Not once did they show any type of just any kind of turmoil or it's like they don't believe it. They just like are living in like their heads in the clouds and not really thinking of the people that are actually hurting that went through hell, including their own daughters. It's
Mhm.
just really sad.
Hey friends, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It is Tuesday, January 28th, 2025. The Duggar family financial fallout continues. And this story all started back in 2021, if you can believe it, almost 4 years ago when Josh Duggar was picked up by the feds and a whole investigation happened. And now he's sitting in a timeout facility down in Texas for people that do bad things against the federal government and children. And when Josh was arrested, there was a pretty big hit to the Duggar family. And businesses, shows, brands, all these deals the Duggars had, they got upended and canceled. And the only people that have continued to profit off of the Duggar name, for the most part, are the daughters, Ginger and Jill, who have written books. Jill has written one book, whereas Ginger has written like three and a children's book. So Ginger released a book last 2 weeks ago. Not good. Wouldn't recommend it. But there has been other fallout that has happened. The Duggar family name and any associated businesses in Arkansas are not necessarily well appreciated. And whether or not someone is associated with the Duggars or not, or even talks to them, sometimes even a loose affiliation like being an extended family member can hurt your business. Couple that with launching a restaurant or opening a restaurant not long after the pandemic hit and moving the restaurant from one location to another apparently spelled a financial disaster for Amy Duggar and her husband Dylan King. Dylan's restaurant, Wellington's, which was slated as a fine dining with whiskey and stogies, first opened and it was located in Rogers, located in the same building that Amy's now closed clothing company 3130 had a boutique. The launch was pretty famously remembered because Jill Duggar and Derek Dillard met up and went to Wellington's and enjoyed cocktails. It was a whole big thing because this was when Jill was kind of letting the world know that she and her husband Derek drank, right? Like they actually have alcoholic beverages sometimes. So the restaurant actually had pretty good reviews, and despite the fact that the location wasn't the best, seemed to be chugging along and doing well for the first few years. In April of 2024, abruptly, Wellington's announced that they were closed and they never opened again. And the closure happened to coincide with a filing by their landlord, Hatcham Investments, who claimed that the restaurant was behind rent. So on April 2nd of 2024, a filing was made by Hatcham Investments against the restaurant Winston Holdings, Wellington's, and Dylan King, Corey Gayer, and Flint Boyce. The landlord at the time alleged that they had an amended lease and they had signed the lease on March 4th of 2022. In the lawsuit, a letter of default, which was mailed to them in January of 2024, let the owners of Wellington's, including Dylan, that they owed a balance of 82,631.50, and they had 15 days per the lease to pay the full amount by January 24th of 2024 to avoid further action. So they were behind rent and they had a ledger. And once they got the notice of default, which was in January, they also, according to a tenant ledger, failed to pay rent for January, February, and March of 2024. So the landlord was suing them for breach of contract as a tenant, unlawful detainer, they meaning they are unlawfully on the property because they had not exited the property and they didn't have legal justification to do it. So it says that the tenant still holds and unlawfully detains the premise without legal justification and without curing its payment defaults under the lease. The landlord is entitled to the issuance of writ of possession, granting it immediate possession of the premise, and they are also entitled to a judgment against the tenants. So they were evicted basically for not following up and paying up on the lease, which then, once the restaurant was shut down for non-payment, they were left to sort out the judgment in this case, which was over $82,000. So, what happened? Well, according to the court filings, this resulted in two of his business partners filing for bankruptcy. Dylan's business partners, Corey and Flint, both filed in the court in October of 2024 notice of bankruptcy. And so they were removed from the judgment as defendants because they had no money to give. And then a consent judgment was filed in November of 2024, which stated that they had entered into an agreement for between Hatcham Investments and Dylan King. So it says the court has jurisdiction over the parties and the subject matter of this case. Venue is proper. The parties have agreed that judgment be entered in favor of plaintiff against defendant Winston Holdings LLC for breach of contract and as alleged in the complaint in the amount of $240,000. The parties further agree that plaintiff Hatcham Investments is awarded recoverable costs of $844.60 and reasonable attorney's fees of $18,982.50. The judgment shall bear interest at a rate of 10%, and the defendant shall file a verified schedule of assets. And this was signed by the parties in the case. And then in November, Dylan entered into a separate settlement agreement with the landlord for breach of contract and admitted to breach of contract. And as a part of this settlement, he agreed that he would pay a total sum of $50,000 in certifiable funds payable in two separate installments. The first was due upon the execution of the agreement. Second was due within 60 days of the agreement. And if they fail to make a full installment payment related to the payment as provided herein, he would be charged interest, and then he would also be deemed in default, and he would have to confess to the judgment in the lawsuit, which was signed in October by the other partners, and would be forced to pay $236,728.08. Woof, that's a big judgment. So Dylan made the first payment, and then he failed to pay the second payment, which then resulted in another judgment being filed against him in January, claiming that he owed over $200,000, and they were demanding a writ of garnishment. Well, according to the court filings, after some back and forth, a judgment was ordered by the court. Mr. Dylan asked for it to be withdrawn, and it appears as of today that a new order has been made and consent by the court. And so what it says is that before the court is agreement between the parties, Hatcham Investments and Dylan King, and the documents filed by in this matter on January 1st are hereby withdrawn. All documents filed by Dylan King are withdrawn. The writ of garnishment filed by the plaintiffs directed at Citizens Bank and Signature Bank in this matter are hereby withdrawn. The hearing for the court for January 28th has been canceled. And it says the parties acknowledge that Dylan King has previously made two $25,000 payments to the plaintiffs against the outstanding judgment and settlement agreement. The parties agree that Dylan King shall make one additional payment to the plaintiffs in the amount of $30,000 to be paid by cashier's check to Friday Eldridge and Clark LLP by March 23rd, 2025. If Dylan timely makes such payment, the judgment against him individually shall be deemed satisfied upon no further action by the parties. If Dylan King fails to timely make such payment, they shall file a motion with the court that he has done a failure to pay, and they agree that in such case, they will automatically be entitled to a judgment against him in the amount of $216,728. It is so ordered, and that was signed by the parties. So he's off the hook for the over 230,000. He just has to make one more payment. Unfortunately, two of his business partners have now declared bankruptcy, and that's just one of the lawsuits and legal problems that Dylan is facing, because in a separate lawsuit that was filed in January of 2024, Dylan was ordered to pay over $100,000, and a judgment was filed on January 2nd by the court. And this one was filed by Hillcrest Holdings, and this was for their first location. So they were first at one location in Rogers, then they moved to another location. They were at the location in Rogers being sued for breach of contract and failure to pay rent. And Dylan and his partners tried to have a list of grievances to get out of it and claim that the landlord wasn't a good landlord, and that's why they didn't pay. Eventually, a consent judgment was granted, and it said that by stipulation and agreement of the plaintiff and the separate defendant, Dylan King, the plaintiff should be and is hereby granted a judgment against Dylan King in the amount of $156,909, which shall accrue an interest hereafter at a rate of 7.25% annually until paid in full. Dylan King is hereby ordered to prepare a schedule verified by affidavit and filed in the circuit clerk's office within 45 days of the date of the consent judgment, describing all of his property, both real and personal, including money, bank accounts, rights, credits, and chooses an action held by him or others for him, and specifying the particular property he claims exempt under the provisions of law. So the two partners declared bankruptcy, and Dylan, instead of declaring bankruptcy, I guess has decided to take the hit here financially. And so they are now going to have to depose them, have them hand over all of their documents, and it is going to be messy for them. And so in February, he will have to sit for a deposition. And as a part of the deposition, the landlords are seeking extensive information about the finances of his life. Basically, it's pretty wild. They're looking for his business and personal tax information, statements of accounts he has, titles to vehicles, boats, trailers, tractors, and other items, deeds to all tracts of real property that he owns and any interest in, trust documents for the trusts of which he is a trustee or beneficiary, documents reflecting ownership of any forms, whether it's cryptocurrency or NFTs, operating agreements by in laws, articles of organizations, articles of incorporation, other such corporate documents for all entities in which he owns a membership of, depreciation schedules, financial statements, and loan applications. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but when Mary Duggar died, Deanna received, as a part of her death, the real estate holdings of a couple businesses and commercial properties that were owned by Mary. And then subsequently, those properties were transferred to Dylan and to Amy. And then, for whatever reason, despite the fact that these buildings had no mortgages out against them, were paid in full by Mary, they took out a loan against these commercial properties. And they have modifications and current mortgage out against these two commercial properties to the tune of like over $735,000. And these properties are registered to a LLC that's in Dylan's name that was revoked by the state of Arkansas. And the properties also have back taxes on them. And those properties now are at risk because Dylan has a judgment out against him, which was filed in Washington County for 150 whatever $9,000. And then now he has another $30,000 that he has to come up with. It seems like what could have happened was when Mary died, they got these properties, then they maybe mortgaged these properties to help bankroll potentially their restaurant. I'm not sure. And restaurants have a high rate of failure. It is one of the riskiest businesses you can go into. And so, couple that with they opened during the pandemic, which was a risky time to open any business, and they had not enough you weren't going to get a lot of patronage at that time. You have multiple locations, you have two broken contracts, and the restaurant ends up failing due to not being able to pay rent. And generally, not being able to pay rent means you don't have the capital coming in sales to support the rent that you're paying. It's just such an unfortunate part of the restaurant industry, but restaurants fail a lot. So they're at risk of losing a lot here, a ton. And I know that when everything went down with Josh, Dylan and Amy had told me that, I don't know, it was a couple years ago that, there was backlash within the community related to the Duggar name and their businesses were taking a hit even though they didn't associate with the Duggars. I think it's just like a complete storm of they had a lot of this stuff was open when they still had a show and they still had the Duggar fame. Then the Duggar fame collapses, then you add a pandemic in it, and it just creates a catastrophe. I really hope they find a way to get out of this and they're able to, pay off their debts or declare bankruptcy. It's sad to know that the property they inherited, though, now is at risk of being potentially forfeited as a part of this judgment for the landlords that they haven't paid. It's a mess. I guess the biggest question is why they didn't file for bankruptcy or why he didn't file for bankruptcy. Maybe it is because he has these other holdings and these other businesses that he didn't want to have to lose. I'm not sure. But bankruptcy could have absolved at least some of these issues. And now this is sort of the after effect. But it's sad because I think I like Dylan and Amy. They're good people. They've always been super nice to me, but that's a lot of money they owe. And it's a risky business venture, and it's more from the Duggar collapse. So, what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed and click the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye, everyone.